In the middle of the Second World War, while their countrymen were still fighting and dying overseas, tens of thousands of captured Italian soldiers found themselves living quietly in the American heartland. They worked on Texas farms. They ate in mess halls in Oklahoma. Some of them, before the war was even over, were going to Sunday dinners in American homes and walking the streets of American towns with money in their pockets. Years later, when they were old men back in Italy, more than a few of them described their time as prisoners of war in the United States, in words that surprised even themselves. One of them called it almost a paradise. That is a strange thing for a prisoner to say. And the story of how it came to be true tells us a great deal about the country that took them in. To understand how they got here, we have to go back to the deserts of North Africa. In the first years of the war, Italy fought alongside Nazi Germany, and much of that fighting took place across the sands of Libya and Egypt. For the Italian soldier, it often went badly. Poorly equipped and poorly led, frequently sent into battles they had little stomach for, Italian troops surrendered in enormous numbers. By the time the fighting in North Africa ended in 1943, the Allies had taken hundreds of thousands of them. That created a problem. Where do you put 250,000 men? Britain, crowded and under bombardment, could not hold them all. So a great many were shipped across the Atlantic to the one Allied nation, with endless space and ample food, the United States. They came by the boatload. In time, somewhere around 50,000 Italian prisoners would be held on American soil, spread across camps in dozens of states. And almost from the moment they arrived, they began to notice that something was very different here. The first thing many of them remembered was the food. These were men who had been hungry for a long time. The Italian army had fed them badly, and the desert had fed them worse. Now, suddenly, they were sitting down to American mess hall meals, with meat and bread and coffee in quantities some of them had not seen in years. For young men who had grown up poor in rural Italy and then half-starved in uniform, the sheer abundance of wartime America was almost difficult to believe. But the abundance was only the surface of it. The deeper reason for their treatment lay in a set of rules the United States took very seriously. In 1929, the major nations had signed an agreement in Geneva setting out how prisoners of war were to be treated. It laid down standards for housing and food and medical care, and it governed labor. Prisoners could be made to work, but they had to be paid for it, and they could not be forced into dangerous jobs tied directly to the war effort. They were to be sheltered and fed to the same standard as the soldiers who guarded them. The United States chose to honor those rules carefully, and not only out of decency. There was hard logic behind it. American servicemen were being held in German and Japanese camps, and Washington understood that the way America treated its prisoners might shape the way its own captured sons were treated overseas. Kindness, in this sense, was also a form of insurance, so the Italian prisoners were housed in proper barracks. They received medical and dental care, sometimes better than they had ever known at home. They were given canteen coupons for the work they did, a kind of camp money they could spend on cigarettes and small comforts. They were allowed to cook some of their own food, and the army even adjusted rations so they could make the Italian dishes they missed. There were camp gardens and camp theaters, soccer matches on Sunday afternoons, and chapels where they could hear Mass. For prisoners of war, it was already a remarkably gentle captivity. And then, in the autumn of 1943, something happened that changed everything. Italy switched sides. In September of 1943, the Italian government surrendered to the Allies and soon after declared war on Germany. Overnight, the men in those American camps were in a strange position. They were prisoners of a country that was no longer their enemy. Their homeland was now, officially, fighting on the same side as the United States. Washington faced a question with no easy answer. What do you do with 50,000 prisoners who are no longer quite prisoners? You could not simply send them home across an ocean still prowled by U-boats to a country that was itself now a battlefield. But it no longer felt right to keep them behind wire as enemies. The American solution was unusual, and it is the heart of this story. Italian prisoners were invited to volunteer as what the Army called co-operators. If they signed on, they would form Italian service units and work in support of the American war effort, in depots and kitchens and workshops, freeing up American soldiers for the front. They would never be asked to fight. In return, they were given something close to freedom. Tens of thousands of them said yes. What followed is the part that older Italians would describe decades later with a kind of wonder. The men in these Italian service units were issued new uniforms with Italy stitched on the shoulder. They were paid, and they were given leave. And on that leave, they were allowed out of the camps and into American life. This is where America itself becomes the real subject, because the country they stepped into was not a country of strangers. By the 1940s, the United States was home to millions of Italian Americans. There were huge Italian communities in New York and Boston, in Chicago and San Francisco, and in countless smaller towns besides. When word spread that young Italian soldiers, men who spoke the old language, were living in camps nearby, those communities opened their arms. Italian-American families began inviting the prisoners to dinner. Local Italian parishes welcomed them to Mass. There were dances, where young Italian men in uniform met American girls, some of them daughters of immigrants from the very same regions of Italy. There were Sunday meals of pasta and homemade wine that must have felt, to a homesick prisoner, like a window straight back into the world he had lost. Some of these prisoners fell in love. A number of them, after the war, would return to the United States to marry the women they had met and to build American lives. The man who had arrived chained to the war would one day come back of his own free will, as a husband and, in time, a citizen. Now, it would be wrong to paint all of this as a simple, sunlit story, and an honest account has to say so. Not every prisoner had it this gentle. Those who refused to cooperate, who stayed loyal to the old alliance with Germany, were kept apart and treated far more strictly. The work could be hard and monotonous, and many Americans, with sons fighting and dying overseas, deeply resented the sight of enemy prisoners eating well and dancing with local girls. They said so in letters to newspapers, and the question of whether the prisoners were being coddled reached all the way to Washington. We should also remember that the Italian experience was, in many ways, the exception. German prisoners in America, far more numerous, lived under tighter discipline and a colder suspicion. Across the wider war in other countries and other camps, captivity could mean hunger, forced labor, and death. The comfort the Italians found in America was real, but it was the product of a particular moment and a particular set of rules. Even so, set against the whole brutal sweep of the Second World War, what happened in those camps stands out. Here was a nation in the middle of a fight for its life that chose to feed, pay, and ultimately befriend the very men it had captured. When the war ended in 1945, the Italian prisoners went home. Most were repatriated over the following months, carried back to a battered and impoverished Italy. They returned to ruined towns and an uncertain future, and many of them carried with them a memory that did not fit the usual picture of war. They had been the enemy. They had been captured and held for years far from home. And yet what stayed with them was the welcome, the food, the music, the families who had set an extra place at the table, and a country that had treated them not as a hatred to be punished, but as men to be looked after. A good number of them could never quite let it go. In the years that followed, some made their way back to America for good, joining the long line of immigration that had built the country in the first place. They settled in the very towns where they had once been prisoners and raised American children of their own. There is a quiet irony in that, and it is where the story really lands. The barbed wire did not keep these men out of America. In the end, for many of them, it pointed them toward it. That, perhaps, is the truest measure of what happened in those camps. A country reveals itself in how it treats the people most completely in its power, and the America of those years, for all its flaws, chose decency toward men it had every reason to resent. The prisoners noticed. They remembered. And some of them spent the rest of their lives proving it, by coming home to the country that had once held them captive.